The desert wind carried whispers of something impossible across the firing range at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. It was 5:47 hours when the first reports came through. A shot that shouldn't have existed, a grouping that defied physics, and a figure in worn fatigues who moved like she'd been born in the sand. The SEALs gathered at the 1,000-yard line had stopped their morning drills, binoculars trained on a solitary shooter whose silhouette seemed carved from the dawn itself. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that precedes revelation hung in the air, thick as cordite smoke. Master Chief Vincent Kowalski lowered his rangefinder, his weathered face unreadable, and muttered something his men couldn't hear. They didn't need to. The scoreboard told a story that would ripple through Naval Special Warfare Command before the sun cleared the horizon. 10 rounds, 10 perfect impacts, each one threaded through a target aperture the size of a quarter at a distance where most shooters struggled to hit a dinner plate. The woman didn't celebrate. She simply cleared her weapon with movements so economical they seemed choreographed, slung the rifle across her back, and began the long walk back to the ready line. Someone had to ask the question burning in every mind present. Who the hell is that? The answer would take the rest of the day to fully understand, but the name on everyone's lips by breakfast was Kovac. Just Kovac. No rank offered, no unit patch visible, nothing but a reputation that preceded her like a shockwave. If you knew where to look, if you ran in the circles that dealt in whispered legends and operations that never made it to paper. She'd been a ghost for 3 years, dropped from the active roster after an incident in the Hindu Kush that remained classified at levels most of these operators would never access. The official story was medical discharge. The unofficial version, the one that circulated in secure rooms and over encrypted channels, suggested something far more complex. What brought her back to Coronado wasn't nostalgia. The base command had extended an invitation framed as a courtesy, a chance to observe modern training protocols, to see how the teams had evolved since her time. But everyone with clearance knew the truth. They needed her for something. The question wasn't whether she could still shoot. The morning had answered that with brutal clarity. The question was whether she could still be who they needed her to be, whether 3 years away from the fight had dulled the edge that once made her the most feared sniper in a generation. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of ocean salt and gunpowder. Kovac kept walking, her face betraying nothing, while behind her the SEALs began to understand they weren't watching a demonstration. They were witnessing the return of something they thought was extinct. The range master's shack smelled of coffee gone bitter, and the particular staleness that comes from too many early mornings. Kovac stepped inside without knocking, her presence filling the cramped space with an energy that made Kowalski look up from his logbook. He was a man who'd seen 3 decades of warfare, who'd trained hundreds of snipers, and the look he gave her carried equal parts respect and wariness. "Didn't expect you to actually show," he said, pushing a mug across the scarred desk. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the ceramic with the same precision she'd shown on the range. "Didn't expect to be invited back." Her voice carried the faint trace of an accent, Balkan, maybe Croatian, worn smooth by years of English but still there in the consonants. Kowalski leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "You're grouping this morning. Want to explain how someone who hasn't touched a rifle in 3 years shoots like they never left?" Kovac sipped the coffee, grimaced at its bitterness but didn't complain. Muscle memory doesn't forget. Neither do I. It was the kind of answer that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. Kowalski had read her file, the unredacted version, the one that required 3 different clearances and a sit-down with a naval intelligence officer who'd made it clear that asking too many questions was a career-limiting move. He knew about Kandahar, about the village whose name was scrubbed from every database, about the shot that traveled 2,100 meters through wind that should have made it impossible, the shot that ended a hostage situation and killed a target so high value his death shifted the entire complexion of operations in the region. He also knew about what came after. "The Admiral wants to see you at 1400 hours, Kowalski said, changing subjects with the smoothness of a man who'd learned when to push and when to let things breathe. "Building 6, second floor. They've got a briefing package." Kavet's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear. She'd burned through that particular emotion somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, but calculation. What kind of package? Kowalski stood, moving to the window that overlooked the range. The SEALs were back to their drills, but he could see the distraction in their movements, the way they kept glancing toward the 1,000-yard line as if expecting another impossible feat. The kind that requires someone who can make shots that shouldn't exist, the kind that needs a ghost. He turned back to face her. They're calling it Operation Sundown. Maritime interdiction, hostile waters, zero margin for error. Target acquisition at extreme range from a moving platform in contested airspace. The last part made Kavet's eyebrow rise fractionally. Airspace, Kowalski nodded. They're not just bringing you back as a sniper, Kavet. They need what you were before the army, before Afghanistan. They need a pilot who can shoot. The coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. For the first time since arriving at Coronado, Kavet's carefully maintained neutrality cracked, revealing something raw underneath. The briefing room in Building 6 was deliberately Spartan, designed to focus attention on the wall-mounted screens and the operational details they would display. Kavet arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from her first life in aviation, and found herself alone with the hum of cooling systems and her own thoughts. The walls were decorated with the usual military fare, photographs of carrier groups, historical images of naval aviators, unit citations in frames that had gone slightly yellow with age. She stopped in front of one image in particular, a black and white photograph from the 90s showing an F-14 Tomcat in a hard banking turn, vapor trails streaming from its wings like the contrails of angels. She'd learned to fly in a Tomcat, back when such things were still possible, before the platform was retired, and the young pilots who dreamed of flying them had to settle for Super Hornets and legacy platforms that lacked the raw, violent beauty of the Grumman fighter. Her call sign had been born in a Tomcat, Valkyrie, given to her not because of the mythology, though that resonated well enough, but because of what happened during her third carrier landing, when a hydraulic failure had turned a routine recovery into a controlled crash that should have killed her and her RIO. Instead, she'd ridden the dying aircraft onto the deck with such precision that the landing signal officer had simply stared, speechless, before declaring it the most beautiful disaster he'd ever witnessed. "Thought I'd find you here." The voice belonged to Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man whose career had spanned from the tail end of the Cold War through the forever wars of the 21st century. He entered the room with the easy authority of someone who'd commanded carrier strike groups and made decisions that shaped theater-level operations. Kavet turned, her posture shifting into something resembling attention without quite getting there. Old habits, complicated by 3 years of civilian life and the particular kind of damage that comes from being asked to do impossible things and then being discarded when those things became politically inconvenient. "Admiral." Thorne gestured for her to sit, taking his own chair at the head of the conference table. "I'm going to dispense with the pleasantries because I know you hate them and we don't have time. What I'm about to tell you is compartmented at the TSSCI level with additional SAP protocols. You'll sign the papers after, but I need you to understand the stakes before we go further." Kavet nodded once. Thorne opened a tablet, tapped it twice, and the main screen illuminated with a satellite image of an island chain Kavet didn't immediately recognize. 2 weeks ago, a maritime interdiction in the South China Sea went sideways. We lost a SEAL team, not killed but captured. 6 operators, extracted from their insertion craft by forces we're still identifying. Chinese special operations, Russian Wagner Group contractors, or something else entirely. The intelligence is murky. He zoomed the image, revealing a fortified compound on the largest island, surrounded by overlapping fields of fire and what looked like mobile SAM batteries. The satellite imagery rotated on the screen, revealing layers of defensive emplacements that would make any conventional rescue operation a bloodbath. Kavet studied the compound with the particular intensity she reserved for problems that required unconventional solutions. Thorne watched her face, reading the micro-expressions that betrayed her tactical mind working through scenarios. The captured seals are being held in the central structure, Thorne continued, highlighting a reinforced building with walls that looked thick enough to withstand anything short of a bunker buster. We have intermittent signals intelligence suggesting they're alive, but that window is closing. The hostiles know we know where they are. They're either waiting for a rescue attempt to turn into a propaganda victory, or they're preparing to move the prisoners to a location we can't track. Kavach leaned forward, her eyes tracing the approach vectors, the sight lines, the killing zones that would shred any helicopter insertion. You need someone to suppress the SAM batteries from the air while a ground team moves in. Thorne shook his head. We need someone to do that from an aircraft that technically doesn't exist, carrying a weapon system that shouldn't be possible, making shots that will rewrite the doctrine on aerial precision engagement. He tapped the tablet again, and the screen split to show technical schematics of an aircraft Kavach had never seen before. It was sleek in the way experimental platforms always are, with a profile that suggested stealth characteristics and payload capabilities that seemed to violate physics. "This is the X-47 Wraith," Thorne said quietly. "A classified development program that's been testing out of Groom Lake for 5 years. Unmanned capable, but optimized for a pilot who can think faster than any AI we've developed. It carries a specialized sniper system, the M17 Longbow, mounted on a gyro-stabilized platform that compensates for aircraft movement, wind shear, and target motion." Kavach's expression remained neutral, but Thorne could see the hunger in her eyes. This was the kind of problem she'd been built to solve, the intersection of her two skill sets in a way that shouldn't exist but somehow did. "You want me to shoot from a moving aircraft at targets on the ground, in contested airspace, with zero margin for error. I want you to do what you did in the Hindu Kush, but at Mach 0.9 and 30,000 feet, Thorne corrected. The Wraith has the capability. The weapon system has been tested in controlled conditions. What we don't have is a pilot who can merge aviation and marksmanship at the level this mission requires." He paused, letting the weight settle. "The SEALs who trained under you in 2019, before Afghanistan, 2 of them are in that compound. Lieutenant Marcus Webb and Petty Officer First Class James Okoro. They're waiting for someone to pull off a miracle." Kavach's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Webb and Okoro. She remembered them. Webb with his Texas drawl and his uncanny ability to read wind at distances that made other snipers weep. Okoro with his mathematical mind that could calculate trajectories faster than most ballistic computers. Good men, better operators. "When do I see the aircraft?" Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already made the decision. The classified hangar at Naval Air Station, North Island, existed in that peculiar space where government budgets intersected with technological ambition. Kavach followed Thorne through security checkpoints that required retinal scans and armed guards who looked like they'd been selected for their ability to shoot first and never bother with questions. The Wraith waited in the hangar's center, suspended in LED lighting that made its composite skin seem to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. Kavach approached slowly, her eyes taking in every detail with the focused attention of a pilot who understood that aircraft had personalities, quirks, and tolerances that no technical manual could fully capture. It was smaller than she'd expected, with a wingspan that suggested maneuverability over payload capacity. The cockpit was a bubble of advanced materials that provided visibility while maintaining stealth characteristics. What captured her attention most was the ventral mount, a housing that looked like it belonged on a precision instrument rather than an aircraft, connected to targeting systems that fed into the pilot's heads-up display through fiber optic channels. The M17 Longbow system is a .50 caliber rifle modified with smart projectiles, said a woman emerging from beneath the aircraft, her coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and her hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was young, maybe late 20s, with the particular intensity that marked the truly brilliant. "I'm Dr. Simmons, weapons integration. This is my baby, or at least the part that goes bang." Kavach extended a hand, nodding the firm grip and the calluses that suggested someone who worked with tools, not just theories. Walk me through it. Simmons' face lit up with the enthusiasm of an engineer asked to explain her life's work. The rifle itself is fixed-mounted, but the entire platform can gimbal through 45 degrees of motion in any direction. The targeting system uses a combination of GPS, LiDAR, and thermal imaging to identify targets and calculate ballistic solutions in real time. The rounds are guided, microfins that deploy after leaving the barrel, controlled by an onboard processor that adjusts trajectory mid-flight. In theory, you can hit a target the size of a basketball from 6 miles away while traveling at 500 knots. In theory, Kovach repeated, her tone suggesting she knew the distance between theory and reality. Simmons grinned. In practice, we've hit static targets at 4 miles in controlled conditions, but we've never had a pilot with your background. Someone who understands both the aircraft and the weapon, who can feel the shot the way a sniper does on the ground. Thorne interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of command. You have 72 hours to train on the system, 3 days to become proficient enough to attempt something that's never been done in combat conditions. The SEALs in that compound don't have longer than that. Kovach walked around the Wraith, her hand trailing along its fuselage. The first flight happened at dawn, when the marine layer rolled in thick, and the Pacific Ocean became an indistinct gray mass below. Kovach sat in the Wraith's cockpit, her hands running through the pre-flight checklist with movements that came from muscle memory older than the aircraft itself. The systems were different, more automated, more integrated, but the fundamental relationship between pilot and machine remained unchanged. She was asking it to keep her alive. It was asking her to push it to its limits. Valkyrie, this is Tower. You're cleared for immediate departure, Vector 270. Climb to Angels 30 and hold for weapons check. The radio voice was calm, professional, but Kovach could hear the undercurrent of curiosity. Everyone at North Island knew something unusual was happening in the classified spaces, and a pilot returning from ghost status to fly an aircraft that didn't officially exist was the kind of story that generated speculation. Tower, Valkyrie copies. 270, Angels 30. Her hands moved across the controls, and the Wraith responded with a purr of engines that was quieter than she expected, more refined. The takeoff was smooth, the aircraft lifting off the runway with minimal roll, and climbing into the overcast with the kind of steady grace that suggested sophisticated fly-by-wire systems doing most of the work. But Kovach could feel where the automation ended and pure aerodynamics took over, could sense the places where pilot input would matter most. At 30,000 feet, the world below disappeared into cloud cover, and the sky above became an impossible blue. Kovach leveled off, trimmed the aircraft, and felt the Wraith settle into cruise configuration. Valkyrie switched to tactical frequency. Weapons check in 60 seconds. She changed channels, and Dr. Simmons' voice replaced the tower controller. How's she feel? Responsive. Maybe too responsive. I'm going to need to recalibrate my inputs or I'll overcontrol in combat conditions. That's the neural interface system. It reads your intentions through pressure sensors in the stick and throttle, anticipates what you want before you fully execute. Takes about 10 hours to adapt to it fully. Kovach filed that information away. 10 hours she didn't have. Beginning weapons check. The heads-up display shifted, overlaying targeting data across her field of vision. A practice target appeared on her screen, a decommissioned ship anchored 15 miles offshore, marked with thermal signatures that simulated human heat patterns. The ballistic computer began feeding her information: range, wind speed at multiple altitudes, target motion. Even though the ship was stationary, the data accounted for Earth's rotation at this latitude. Target acquired. Calculating shot. The crosshairs on her HUD moved independently of the aircraft's flight path, the gimbal system adjusting the rifle's position to account for her velocity and vector. Kovach watched the solution develop, saw the firing window appear, a golden circle that expanded and contracted with atmospheric changes. The first shot left the longbow system with barely a whisper. the sound dampened by suppressors and the thin air at altitude. Kavach felt the recoil through the aircraft's structure, a subtle shudder that wouldn't have been noticeable to anyone less attuned to the machine. The round itself traveled faster than sound, a projectile that started as pure ballistics and transformed into something else as its guidance fins deployed and the onboard processor took control. Through the targeting system, she watched its flight, a curved path that compensated for wind shear, air density, and the Coriolis effect. The impact came 4.7 seconds after firing, the thermal imagery showing the round punching through the target plate exactly where the ballistic computer had predicted. Center mass. Perfect hit. Holy shit, Simmons breathed over the radio. That's the first time we've achieved a hit on the first try at this range. Most pilots need 3 or 4 shots to calibrate their feel for the system. Kavach didn't respond immediately. She was already analyzing the shot, breaking down what the computer had done versus what she'd felt through the aircraft. The Wraith had dipped fractionally during the firing sequence, a reaction to the rifle's recoil that the flight control system had compensated for but hadn't eliminated entirely. On a static test, that wouldn't matter. In combat with multiple targets and time compression, it could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Running Scenario 2, she said, her voice flat. The HUD updated with a new challenge. 3 targets this time, spaced across a 2-mile radius with a time constraint that would require her to engage all 3 within 90 seconds. The difficulty wasn't just the shooting, it was the flying. She'd have to maneuver the Wraith to bring each target into the Longbow's engagement envelope, while maintaining the speed and altitude parameters that kept the ballistic solutions valid. Kavach pushed the throttle forward, and the aircraft responded with acceleration that pressed her back into the ejection seat. The first target came up fast, and she let the targeting computer feed her the solution while her hands worked the stick, banking the Wraith into a position that felt wrong to her pilot instincts but was optimal for the shot. The rifle fired. She didn't wait to confirm the hit, trusting the system while her attention shifted to Target 2. This one required a hard turn that would put G-forces on the airframe and complicate the ballistic calculation. She pulled the stick, feeling the Wraith's wings bite into the air, feeling her body compress under acceleration that modern flight suits mitigated but couldn't eliminate. The targeting reticle danced across her HUD, stabilizers working to compensate for the turn. The firing solution appeared later than she wanted, the window smaller. She took the shot anyway, intuition and calculation merging in the moment. Target 3 required her to reverse course, a maneuver that would bleed energy and put her below optimal engagement speed. But Kavach had spent years learning to work within constraints, to make impossible shots from impossible positions. The Wraith carved through the sky like something alive, responding to inputs that merged conscious thought with the kind of instinct that couldn't be taught. Kavach rolled the aircraft inverted, pulled through the maneuver until she was tracking back toward the third target with airspeed dropping, but still within acceptable parameters. The targeting computer struggled with the angle, the ballistic solution flickering as variables shifted faster than the processors could integrate. This was the moment that separated good pilots from exceptional ones, where technology reached its limits and human intuition had to fill the gap. Kavach stopped fighting the computer, stopped trying to force the solution, and simply felt the shot the way she had on 1,000 ranges across a dozen countries. The wind at altitude, the aircraft's momentum, the target's position relative to Earth's rotation, all of it compressed into a single instant of clarity. She fired without waiting for the golden circle to stabilize. The round left the longbow system and Kavach immediately pulled up, climbing back to 30,000 feet while the ballistic data scrolled across her HUD. 3 seconds, 4, 5, the thermal feed updated, 3 hits, all center mass, all within the kill zone. Simmons' voice came through with barely controlled excitement. Valkyrie, that last shot, the computer hadn't locked the solution. You fired manually. Negative. I fired when the shot was right. It was a distinction that would be lost on anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read wind and dust particles and mirage shimmer, who hadn't developed the particular intuition that turned marksmanship into something that looked like magic to observers, but was actually just pattern recognition refined to its absolute limit. "Bring it home," Thorne's voice cut through the tactical channel. "We need to debrief and plan the mission profile. You've proven the concept. Now we need to apply it to a target that shoots back." Kovach banked the Wraith toward North Island, descending through the marine layer until the California coast resolved from gray abstraction into concrete reality. The landing was smooth, the aircraft touching down with barely a chirp of tires, and as she taxied back to the classified hangar, she allowed herself a moment of something that might have been satisfaction. She'd been away for 3 years, had wondered if the edge was still there, if the skills that had defined her would survive dormancy. The morning had answered that question, but it had also revealed something else. The shot from an aircraft wasn't just about marksmanship or flying. It was about merging two disciplines so completely that they became indistinguishable, about reaching a state of flow where the machine became an extension of will, and the bullet became an extension of intention. She'd done it before, in the mountains of Afghanistan, from a helicopter that had no business being stable enough for precision shooting. She'd done it this morning in controlled conditions. The question was whether she could do it when people she cared about were depending on her, when the margin for error was measured in millimeters and milliseconds. The debriefing room smelled of coffee and the particular tension that preceded high-stakes operations. Kovach sat across from Thorne, and a collection of officers whose unit patches suggested they came from the shadowy corners of Naval Special Warfare Command. Maps covered the walls, satellite feeds updated in real time on mounted screens, and the atmosphere carried the weight of men and women who'd spent careers planning operations where failure meant funerals. "The compound is heavily defended," began a Marine Corps colonel whose name tape read Harrison. He was lean in the way career infantry officers often were, with eyes that had seen too much and hands that moved with the economical precision of someone who'd spent time in places where wasted motion could get you killed. "Mobile SAM batteries here, here, and here." He indicated positions on the map with a laser pointer. "Integrated air defense, radar coverage that overlaps, and quick reaction teams that can respond to any breach in under 4 minutes. Kovach studied the map, her mind already working through approach vectors and firing solutions. "What's the SEAL team's status?" "Alive as of 6 hours ago," Thorne answered. "We intercepted a communication, encrypted, but our people broke it. They're being held in the central building, 2nd floor, eastern wing. Windows are barred, but the walls aren't reinforced beyond standard military construction. The problem isn't getting them out. It's suppressing the defenses long enough for an extraction team to operate." "How long is long enough?" Harrison exchanged a look with Thorne before answering. 12 minutes from insertion to exfiltration. The Hellos will come in low and fast, but they'll be vulnerable during the pickup phase. We need those SAM batteries neutralized before they can acquire and fire. 12 minutes. Kovach ran the calculations in her head. 3 SAM batteries, each requiring multiple shots to ensure destruction. The compound's layout meant she couldn't take a single approach vector. She'd have to maneuver the Wraith through multiple attack runs, each one exposing her to ground fire and the possibility that the hostiles had capabilities intelligence hadn't identified. "What about fighter escort?" "Negative," Thorne said flatly. "This operation is deniable. The Wraith stealth profile gives us plausible deniability if something goes wrong. The moment we put F-35s in the air, this becomes an official military action with all the political consequences that entails. You go in alone." The words hung in the air. Alone. The way she'd been alone in Afghanistan when the operation went wrong, when the intelligence failed, and the supposedly secure landing zone turned into a kill box that had left her helicopter's crew chief dead, and her co-pilot with injuries that ended his career. The way she'd been alone when she made the shot that saved the hostages but violated rules of engagement written by people who'd never held a rifle in anger. Ground team composition. Her voice remained steady, professional, but Harrison caught the slight tension in her jaw. 12 operators, mix of SEALs and Marine Raiders, all Tier 1 qualified. They've trained together for 2 weeks on the compound mock-up we built at Fort Hunter Liggett. They know the layout, know the timing, and they know their survival depends on you keeping the sky clear. The mission planning consumed the next 48 hours. Kavach spent them in a windowless room with maps, satellite imagery, and weather forecasts that predicted marginal conditions. Cloud cover that would help conceal the extraction helos, but would complicate her targeting, winds that shifted with altitude in ways that would push the longbow system to its operational limits. She memorized every detail of the compound, studying the SAM battery positions until she could visualize them with her eyes closed, calculating firing solutions from multiple approach vectors and backup plans for when the primary vector became untenable. Because it would. Combat operations never survived contact with the enemy intact. The best you could do was build in enough flexibility to adapt when everything went wrong. Dr. Simmons appeared periodically with technical updates, refinements to the longbow system software based on the training flights, adjustments to the targeting algorithms that would give Kavach fractionally better response times. Fractional advantages mattered when the difference between success and failure was measured in degrees and milliseconds. The SMART rounds have a maximum effective range of 6 miles in optimal conditions, Simmons explained during one of these sessions, her fingers manipulating a three-dimensional holographic display that showed the compound and surrounding airspace. But optimal doesn't account for the wind shear you'll encounter at the target location, or the fact that you'll be firing during a banking turn at least twice during the sequence. Kavach nodded, her eyes tracking the holographic trajectory lines. It's the reload time between shots. The system is magazine-fed, 10 rounds per magazine. Reload time is 4.2 seconds, but that's automated. You won't need to do anything except maintain stable flight during the transition. 4.2 seconds, an eternity in combat. Enough time for a radar system to acquire her, for a SAM battery to get a firing solution, for everything to collapse into chaos and fire. I'll need to stay in motion, Kavach said, more to herself than to Simmons. Serpentine approach, never the same vector twice. Maximum altitude for the first shots, then descending for the follow-ups when they start adjusting their defensive posture. Simmons looked at her with something approaching awe. You're thinking 3 moves ahead. Most pilots struggle to manage the immediate shot. Most pilots aren't snipers. It wasn't arrogance, just fact. The skill sets rarely overlapped. Aviation required managing systems, thinking in 3 dimensions, processing information from multiple sources simultaneously. Marksmanship required focus that narrowed the world to a single point, breathing that synchronized with heartbeat, the ability to feel environmental conditions through senses that most people didn't know existed. Merging them meant living in a state of controlled schizophrenia, splitting attention between the macro and micro, the aircraft and the rifle, survival and mission. Thorne entered the planning room at hour 43, his face carrying the particular weariness of command. We have movement on the compound. Intelligence suggests they're preparing to relocate the prisoners. The mission launches in 9 hours. Night fell over North Island with the soft inevitability of the Pacific Marine layer rolling in. Kavach stood beside the Wraith in the hangar, her flight suit already donned, her personal weapon, a Sig Sauer M18 that had traveled with her through 3 deployments, secured in a shoulder holster that regulations said she didn't need but experience insisted upon. The ground crew moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, performing the final checks that would either keep her alive or become irrelevant in the next few hours. She thought about Webb and Okoro, about the training sessions where she taught them to read wind by watching grass bend, to calculate range by understanding how heat mirage distorted images at different distances. Good students, better men. The kind of operators who made the military's recruitment commercials look honest instead of aspirational. They were depending on her to do something that had never been done in combat, that existed in the gray space between theoretical possibility and practical impossibility. No pressure. She smiled at that thought, a brief flicker of dark humor that helped settle the pre-mission tension coiling in her gut. Master Chief Kowalski approached from the hangar entrance, carrying a tablet that displayed the final mission brief. Weather update. Clouds ceiling at 8,000 feet over the target area, winds gusting to 30 knots at your altitude. It's going to be sporty. Kovacs took the tablet, scanning the meteorological data with eyes that translated numbers into felt experience. 30-knot winds meant the Longbow's ballistic computer would be working overtime, meant she'd need to trust the system while simultaneously being ready to override it when her instincts and its calculations diverged. Ground team status. Staged and ready. They'll launch from the amphibious assault ship Bataan the moment you confirm the SAM batteries are neutralized. Hello flight time to target is 18 minutes, which gives you a narrow window to work with. 18 minutes. She'd need to eliminate 3 SAM batteries, confirm their destruction, and maintain station over the compound to provide cover for the extraction, all while avoiding detection by radar systems that were designed to find aircraft exactly like the Wraith, operated by hostiles who would be highly motivated to shoot her down the moment they realized what was happening. The Admiral wanted me to give you this. Kowalski handed her a small box, unmarked except for a handwritten note on top. She opened it, finding a pair of wings, vintage naval aviator wings from an earlier era, the kind that predated modern manufacturing and carried the weight of history. The note was in Thorne's handwriting. These belonged to my father. He flew Tomcats off the Enterprise during Desert Storm. Bring them back. Kovacs pinned the wings to her flight suit, feeling their weight settle over her heart. It was a gesture that transcended the transactional nature of military operations, a reminder that what she was about to do mattered not just tactically but personally, that she was part of a lineage of people who'd been asked to do impossible things and had somehow found ways to make them possible. The Wraith lifted into the darkness at 200 hours, climbing through the marine layer into a sky scattered with stars that seemed impossibly distant and coldly beautiful. Kovacs flew on instruments initially, trusting the aircraft's systems to navigate through the clouds, until she broke into clear air at 12,000 feet. The Pacific stretched below, invisible except where moonlight caught the wave tops and turned the ocean into hammered silver. She settled into the rhythm of long-distance flight, monitoring systems and fuel consumption while her mind ran through the mission profile one final time. The transit to the target area would take 3 hours at the Wraith's cruising speed, a journey that would carry her over international waters and into the gray spaces where sovereignty became negotiable and military operations happened in the shadows. Valkyrie, this is Overwatch. Radio check. The call came from the operations center at North Island, where Thorne and his staff would monitor the mission through satellite feeds and encrypted communications. Kovacs recognized the voice as belonging to Commander Sarah Reeves, the operations officer who'd spent 2 decades coordinating missions that never made it to the news. Overwatch, Valkyrie reads you 5x5. Copy. Your flight path is clear. No contacts on radar, no indication of hostile awareness. Ground team is wheels up in 90 minutes. Weather at target area is as briefed, marginal but acceptable. Kovacs acknowledged and returned her attention to the instruments. The Wraith hummed around her, systems operating in the green, the aircraft performing exactly as designed. But she knew from experience that equipment reliability was only part of the equation. The human element, her ability to execute under pressure, to make decisions in compressed time frames, to merge piloting and shooting into a single fluid action. That was where missions succeeded or failed. At hour 2, the Wraith's radar warning receiver chirped softly. A search radar had painted her, likely from a Chinese surveillance vessel operating in international waters. The stealth characteristics should make her appear as nothing more than a weather anomaly or a flock of birds, but Kovacs felt the familiar spike of adrenaline that came from knowing she'd been seen, even if not recognized. She adjusted her course slightly, putting more distance between herself and the contact, and the radar lock dropped. The ocean passed beneath her, vast and indifferent. Kovacs thought about the path that had brought her here, the girl who'd fled war in the Balkans and found refuge in America, who joined the military because it offered citizenship and purpose, who discovered she had a talent for violence that could be channeled into something that felt like service. The girl who'd become Valkyrie, the woman who'd lost that identity in the Hindu Kush and had spent 3 years trying to figure out who she was without it. Maybe this mission would answer that question. Maybe it would just be another operation, successful or failed, added to the long list of things she'd done that would never be publicly acknowledged. The target area appeared on her radar at hour 3, a cluster of returns that resolved into the compound, the SAM batteries, and the supporting infrastructure that intelligence had identified. Kavach began her descent, bringing the Wraith down to 20,000 feet while her eyes swept the darkness for any sign.